To my surprise last night, Sunak and co moved to quash reports that they were looking to make a deal with the man who pushed for Brexit and thus made every household in the land poorer by £1,000 at least. Source, the Bank of England. Farage and his new company, his political vehicle Reform is a company, are giving Tory MPs sleepless nights because Reform is gaining in the polls to within a few points of the Tories nationally. And this has led backbenchers to beg the Prime Minister to make Farage the UK's ambassador to the United States or hand him a peerage, effectively to buy him off. Among voters in the C2DE social classes, Reform is actually ahead of the Tories, 23 points to 22. Reform is also ahead of the Tories in the north of England, 21 to 18. A serious threat to the Tories then. Farage at present is the Reform company's honourable president. The company's recent bounce in the polls has got the veteran opportunist weighing up his chances once again. Farage told the Unheard website the other day that, quote, maybe, just maybe, he will stand again. Quotes, there's an historic opportunity to really change things, he said. I edge towards thinking that may be the case. Doody, 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 doody. He's only failed, of course, to be elected to Parliament 7 times on the bounce, as our Nigel. Will he risk making it 8 losses in a row, though? Or wouldn't he rather trade all that uncertainty, all that tub thumping for a nice, cushy job to be our man in Washington? Let's face it, if Trump was to make it to the White House, I would suggest Farage would be in hog heaven. But of course, if Trump ends up in jail, I'm not sure the USA will be quite as appealing for our Nigel. Now, Labour on Friday, as I mentioned before the news, warned against installing Farage as the UK ambassador to Washington, saying such an appointment could undermine Western unity against Russia, because Farage has previously suggested we should be more open to negotiating with Putin, which says a lot about Farage, that. None of it good. A Downing Street spokesman, meanwhile, ruled out offering Farage the ambassadorial role, simply saying, we don't do deals. But looking at how the Tories are tanking in the polls, maybe they should. But even if they did, if you were Nigel Farage, could you be bought off? I'm convinced, I don't know, but I would be convinced. I would be very surprised if he hadn't been offered a seat in the House of Lords already, so I can only assume he's turned that down. Should he fight with Reform, damage the Tories, but run the risk, if he was to stand, of failing to be elected again, or should he take a deal? Well, Tim Barnes is a Conservative parliamentary candidate for cities of London and Westminster. I'm delighted to say joins me first to discuss. Good day to you, Tim.
Good morning, Matthew. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm intrigued by this. I think it's a really interesting political story of our times, because if I was Rishi Sunak, I can't deny I would be very tempted to try and do a deal with Nigel Farage, because I think Reform is going to be a massive problem come election time.
So I can't really see that this is something that is likely to happen in any sense. You just spent the last hour talking about the honours system, and now you're basically putting forward an idea that it should be used to bribe somebody to not run in a political activity. That doesn't really seem to me to be a thing moot. Yeah, but we don't have a direct monarchy these days. Things have moved on somewhat in the last 650 years. There have been, of course, people who are supported in those kind of endeavours, and indeed, just after the Second World War, one of the Labour prime ministers, or actually slightly later, I think it was Jim Callaghan, made his son-in-law the ambassador in order to sort of give him something to do. So there are precedents for this, but I can't see that it's a good idea electorally. I can't see that it's a good idea morally, and I can't see that it's a good idea for the Conservative Party. If you were to reward somebody like Nigel Farage, who after all owns another political party, as I think you were just pointing out, how can you ensure that they would be a Conservative? The Conservative Party has always been an open and welcoming party, the most successful Western political party of the 20th century in terms of the number of elections it's won, the number of years that it's had in power. It has a great sense of what it is that people are looking for, and an ability to reinvent itself as culture and generations change. But the answer for the future can't be Nigel Farage. He is somebody who was proponent of the big idea of the last 25 years, maybe, but not necessarily about where things are going.
See him as actually a Tory party leader in the future.
I don't really think by these kind of, media stories of this is what a large group of Conservative Party MPs say. You've got 350, 360 Tory MPs there, and you have 5 or 6 people who regularly come out saying that they have a different view. It's a tiny proportion of what the bulk of the party in Parliament think, and what necessarily a bulk of the party or Conservative voters think elsewhere. There's no doubt about the fact that he can be a consummate media performer. He's a populist. He's somebody who's able to attract votes. Indeed, he can't only just attract votes, he can attract listeners, which is, of course, why LBC gave him a job, which is more than the Tory party have done. So there's a certain amount of value that you can see in this being a story, but it seems to me there's a reason why it's predominantly the left of the media, it's the Guardian and the Mirror, that have continued to recycle this story rather than anybody who's got actual credibility or well conceived and well informed sources from within the Conservative ranks. Sure. uh, I don't think that Nigel Farage is somebody who ever wants to have to live with the consequences of his own actions. And it's great if you are a campaigner. It's great to lead a minority partner where you get a huge amount of exposure and airtime. It's great to be able to offer a different point of view. But when you actually come down to the hard yards that come from being in any position of elected authority or power, you have to make choices and priorities. And that means you have to disappoint some people. It means that you actually have to think that the quick argument you've come up with, which sounds like man in the pub common sense, might not actually work, is just something he doesn't want to have to live up to and deliver on. So I think he's got a highly lucrative career acting as a warm-up act at Donald Trump rallies, speaking on GB News and elsewhere. And I'm not entirely sure that from Nigel Farage's point of view, that's worth trading in for having to admit that if you run something, it isn't quite as easy as you make it sound.
That conversation. Tim Barnes there, Tory party candidate for the cities of London and Westminster. I'm going to go straight over now to Paul Richards, a Labour commentator. Good morning to you, Paul.
Good morning.
Let's deal with the issue, first of all, of if you were Sunak, would you be tempted to try and buy Farage off?
Well, you must be tempted because the situation is so utterly desperate for the Conservatives, and they've seen their coalition that they painstakingly created around the 2019 election disaggregate and collapse. And as you say, the C2D, that just means working people are dropping away amongst men now, Reform are higher up. I think what's going on, though, is that people are just sick and tired of the potholes and the fact they can't get a dentist and the fact they've got a day-long wait in A&E, and they've fallen out of love with the government. They haven't fallen in love with anyone else yet.
Oh, I like that line. I think that's really interesting. Fallen out of love with the government, but not in love with everybody else. You pretty much defined my position. Ali Miraj yesterday was doing a phone-in in which he suggested that Reform was so close to the Tories, particularly in the north, that traditional Tory voters, he was arguing, should perhaps ditch the Tories to go for Reform, that Reform might be the best party of government for them. Whereas Tim was suggesting that Reform haven't got a snowball's hope in hell.
Well, I mean, historically, sometimes big parties that have been around forever do suddenly collapse and new parties do emerge. And I suppose the last time it happened in this country was when the Liberals collapsed after 1906 and Labour took over from them as a governing party. And within a couple of decades were the government. But this is big stuff. I don't think we're in that situation. I think it's more about people being really annoyed, really fed up and scouting around. And some of those votes are coming to Labour, don't forget. So, some of the by-election wins show that that vote, that crucial C2D vote, is coming to Starmer. He doesn't need to win them all. He needs to win a tiny proportion of them, like 1 in 7 or something like that. If they come over, will deliver a Labour victory. So I think you're seeing this big coalition fracture. I think you're seeing people shopping about, and I think people are just sort of thinking, well, what's the alternative? This is what everything is to play for now in the next 6 months to the election.
If you were involved with Reform Limited, would you? I mean, I think there is a Farage factor. I think if he was active on the campaign trail, I think it would lead to a bounce in Reform's fortunes. I really do. So, if we accept that as the case, do you think Farage would be prepared to risk an 8th loss if he was to stand as an
Well,
MP
I don't know
again?
why people see him as this a great electoral asset. I mean, as you
Well,
say, he's fought 7, lost 7, and he's supposed to be the right wing equivalent of Galloway. Galloway at least keeps winning his
Great
populist
point.
upsurge elections in 3 different parliamentary seats. Farage has never done that, and I think Tim's point about Farage's sort of finances and position and all that are well made. He does make an awful lot of money off his media appearances and his sort of star quality. I mean, I have to say, on a serious point, Matthew, putting him in charge of our relations with the United States at this crucial moment would be balmy, and that is the worst kind of politics, just to sort of throw that as a sop. I mean, that relationship is vital.
But could we quantify that, or qualify that rather, by saying that if Donald Trump was in the White House, maybe, I mean, this is a bit...
It'd be worse. It'd be even worse if that happened. I mean, what a disaster.
Well, I'm just thinking...
Two idiots in charge of our relationship. But I mean, that's not where we want to be, is it?
But they would have some kind of friendship bond, whereas our previous ambassadors, after being critical to Trump, was on the first plane home. So I see. I share your view that it wouldn't be excellent at first glance, but maybe having a friendly.
No, I think on second glance it's pretty worse, actually. I think, and if Farage was serious, he would stand in the Blackpool by-election, wouldn't he? Because that is a classic Reform UK target seat. You would think, in terms of the demographic, people that live there, the jobs that people do. I would say, okay, put your money where your mouth is. Go to Blackpool, see if you can beat us, the Labour and the Conservatives, and whether this upsurge in the polls is reality or not. My suspicion, not.
Just before I let you go, would you agree with me that I suspect that Farage has probably already been offered a seat in the House of Lords at some point by the Tories? I find it hard to imagine that he hasn't.
Well, it's possible, but I mean, given that some of the people are getting on us today and yesterday, I mean, who knows? It's not being done for the merits of the individuals, is it? But I just think, what would that solve? It would just give him an even bigger platform, and for life, he'd be there forever. Then
That's a note to end the discussion on.